The atmosphere in the federal courtroom today was heavy, with all eyes fixed on Judge Victor Hayes, who was famous for his controversial decisions and his firm stance against conservative values. This trial was not an ordinary one. Today, the court was hearing a landmark case. The Trust and Family Fund, a conservative charity organization, was accused of serious financial fraud. This was not just a legal battle, but also a confrontation with powerful political forces, those who had exploited the trust of the community for personal gain. Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary of the administration, was tasked with defending the truth. She was to testify and present evidence of the fund's financial transparency, something that Victor Hayes, the powerful judge, seemed to be trying to cover up or ignore throughout the trial. However, this was not an easy task. Victor Hayes, known for his tough rulings against conservative organizations, had a history of controversial decisions in cases involving organizations like the Trust and Family Fund. The courtroom was packed, everyone silent. Victor Hayes sat in the judge's seat, holding the gavel, preparing for the arguments. The tension in the air was undeniable. You could feel the weight of the case. Every decision in this trial would not only affect the Trust and Family Fund but could also have widespread implications for other conservative political organizations. All eyes were on the inevitable confrontation between Karoline Leavitt and Victor Hayes. Victor Hayes, in a harsh tone, scanning the room, "No coffee in my courtroom," he bellowed, disrupting the silence. His words were not just uncontrolled anger but also a display of the power of a man used to dominating every situation. "Give a warning to the lawyer if they are late again." At that moment, the courtroom door opened, and Karoline Leavitt stepped in, holding a thick stack of documents. She walked through the door with confidence and strength, seemingly unfazed by the presence of Victor Hayes. She knew that justice was not always welcome in a courtroom like this, but she also understood that today she carried a noble mission: to prove the truth. She walked straight into the middle of the room, her gaze fixed firmly on Victor Hayes. Victor Hayes, narrowing his eyes at her, showing clear disdain. "This is not the White House, miss. Your title here means nothing." His words were filled with contempt, trying to diminish Karoline Leavitt's worth. But she remained unshaken, her gaze as steadfast as steel. Karoline Leavitt, keeping her eyes on him, her voice firm with no sign of fear, understood, "Your Honor. But justice cannot be twisted to suit your will." Her words hit him like a punch to the face, making Victor Hayes pause for a moment, even though he didn't want to admit it. Everyone in the courtroom began to sense the rising tension. Victor Hayes sat on the bench, his gaze sharp as a knife, unable to hide his anger. His fury erupted so forcefully that it was hard to contain. His fingers gripped the gavel tightly, as if his joints were about to crack. Every time he clenched his fist, the gavel creaked loudly, like a warning. Karoline Leavitt was the reason he felt he could not control himself. And this made him even more furious. Victor Hayes, growling, trembling with rage, "You want to lecture me about justice? You're just a young girl, a political puppet," he yelled, his voice tearing through the tense silence in the room. Victor Hayes' words were sharp and filled with hatred, striking Karoline Leavitt, who stood firm before him. "You don't know anything about the law." Each of his words was like a punch to Karoline's pride, but she remained unshaken, with no trace of fear. Her gaze remained sharp, never blinking. Karoline Leavitt, unshaken, her gaze cold, her words confident, "I'm not lecturing you, Your Honor. I'm simply proving the truth." Her voice was as cold as a blade, each word cutting through Victor Hayes' arrogance. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew even heavier. The people around fell silent, not daring to breathe too loudly. The tension filled the entire space. Immediately, Victor Hayes could no longer contain his fury. He cut her off with an angry shout, his voice rising high, as if it wanted to tear the very air apart. Victor Hayes, with fury, gripping the gavel tightly, his eyes showing clear anger. "I don't need to hear this nonsense." His voice boomed like thunder, full of power and uncontrolled rage. Each of his words was like a blow to Karoline's dignity, but she stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "Just because you have the documents, do you think you can overthrow me?" His words were an attack, trying to push Karoline into a weak position, but she did not back down. She flipped through the pages of her documents, never taking her eyes off him. Each movement of hers affirming that she was doing the right thing. Karoline Leavitt, her voice unchanged, still calm, yet carrying an unwavering strength. "Would you like to see them?" Her words rang out, strong and fearless. She was not just challenging Hayes, she was challenging the very power he represented. Each word was a declaration of war against the enemy of justice. The courtroom seemed to suffocate in the tension. Karoline Leavitt took a step closer to Victor Hayes, her gaze never leaving him. She knew that the evidence she carried could change everything. And she was not afraid to use it to expose the truth. Audience, whispering, their eyes fixed on the intense scene. "She has courage." This whisper echoed, but like a breeze in a storm. Victor Hayes could feel defeat approaching, but he could not admit it. Every second that passed, Karoline Leavitt made him more uncomfortable. All eyes in the room were on the two of them. Victor Hayes felt defeat closing in. However, he still could not admit it, and he decided to resist the truth Karoline was presenting. His arrogance, his self-assurance as the power, had now crumbled. But instead of accepting defeat, Victor Hayes continued to resist with harsh words. Victor Hayes, his voice growing weaker, but still trying to preserve his pride. His eyes starting to show confusion. You think you can win? You're just a political puppet, an ambitious person trying to take advantage of this situation." His words faltered. And in his eyes, Karoline could see confusion slowly emerging. Though he tried to maintain his arrogance, the truth she brought was undeniable. Karoline Leavitt, unmoved, taking another step closer. Her eyes cold as steel, her voice resolute. "You may continue to defend yourself, but you cannot deny this truth." Her voice rang out challengingly. Each word like a bullet piercing straight into Victor Hayes' inflated ego. She knew she was on the right path, and nothing could change the outcome. Victor Hayes turned to look at Karoline Leavitt, his blood seemed to be boiling, flames of rage igniting in his eyes. His face turned bright red. And his hands gripped the judge's gavel so tightly that his joints seemed ready to crack. The arrogance he had built up over the years was beginning to collapse. The feeling of losing control became more and more apparent, but he could not stop. At this point, everyone in the courtroom could see that Victor Hayes had completely lost his composure. Victor Hayes, turning back, his voice roaring, tearing through the silent air of the courtroom, his eyes flashing with hatred. "Do you want to embarrass me?" His voice sounded like thunder, filled with fury and uncontrollable anger. Each of his words was like a direct attack on Karoline, but she was not afraid. "You have no right to speak to me like that." Victor Hayes' words hit Karoline Leavitt like a slap in the face, but nothing could shake her. She stood tall, her eyes never leaving him, her gaze sharp and fearless. Karoline Leavitt, stepping closer, her voice calm yet full of unwavering strength, her hands tightly holding the documents, showing no sign of worry. "I am not here to embarrass you, Your Honor." She took confident steps toward Victor Hayes, her gaze unwavering, unaffected by his challenge. "I am simply the one bringing the truth, something you seem unwilling to see." Her words echoed as a direct challenge to Victor Hayes' arrogance, a challenge he could not easily dismiss. All eyes in the courtroom were focused on the two of them. Karoline Leavitt was the only one standing firm in this battle. Victor Hayes was beginning to feel defeat, but his arrogance kept him from admitting it. With each passing second, he felt himself standing on the edge, and Karoline Leavitt was the one pushing him down. Victor Hayes, his lips pressed tight, his eyes full of rage, trying to maintain his dignity. But the confusion in his eyes was evident enough. Do you think you can do anything with these empty words? His voice began to waver, although he tried to keep its sharpness. But he could not stop the fear creeping in. Just because you have some documents, do you think you can overthrow me? At this moment, Victor Hayes' pride had disappeared. He looked around, searching for an escape, but found none. His resistance was becoming increasingly meaningless. Karoline Leavitt, her voice still strong, unshaken, her eyes cold as she stared directly at him. You cannot deny the truth, Your Honor. These are your bank statements. Her voice rang out, firm and resolute, each word like a knife piercing the heart of Victor Hayes' arrogance. These transactions came from the Freedom Foundation, and you received money from them on March 16, 2024. Do you think you can hide all of this? Karoline's voice was unwavering. As a challenge Hayes could not deny. The courtroom fell silent, as if they were witnessing the fall of a man who had once been seen as invincible. Victor Hayes, panicking. His eyes fixed on the documents, every movement revealing his confusion. Do you think I'll believe these? You're trying to ruin me. His voice had lost its confidence, replaced by clear fear. He stood frozen, with no reasonable defense left. His helplessness was evident in his eyes. He looked around, as if searching for help, but there was no one who could save him now. Karoline Leavitt, stepping closer, holding the documents in front of Victor Hayes, her eyes piercing him. You can deny everything, but the truth cannot be hidden forever. Her words were a verdict, with no room for resistance. Her gaze was like a blade, not missing any detail that Victor Hayes had tried to conceal. You have power, but justice does not. Her words were a deep cut into Victor Hayes' heart, and he could feel defeat slowly becoming inevitable. His face, once flushed with anger, now turned pale, his strength shattered. The courtroom felt as though it was about to explode. Whispers began to spread, the audience murmuring in astonishment and admiration as they turned their eyes on Karoline Leavitt. She had done what no one dared to do, exposed Victor Hayes' failure, forcing him to face the wrongdoings he had been hiding for so long. Victor Hayes, trembling, his hands still gripping the gavel. But his eyes now filled with confusion, fear taking over his mind. Don't do this. His voice was no longer strong, replaced by panic, his anger turning to fear. He stepped back, searching for an escape, but it was too late. Victor Hayes' steps were no longer steady, he retreated slowly, like a man trapped in the very snare he had created. Karoline Leavitt, raising her hand, her eyes cold and unforgiving. You can't escape the truth anymore. You've dug your own grave. Her voice was final, like a death sentence. She knew Victor Hayes had no way to escape the truth she had brought. She wasn't just fighting for justice, but for the truth everyone needed to hear. Victor Hayes stood there, his hand gripping the gavel tightly, his eyes filled with confusion. Sweat continued to pour down his forehead, yet he still could not accept the truth. He stared intently at the bank statements, trying to find an explanation, but Karoline Leavitt stood firm, her sharp gaze never leaving him. The courtroom was so silent that you could hear the ticking of the clock, each second passing slowly. Victor Hayes, gritting his teeth, lips pressed tight, trying to hide his panic. But his voice lacked confidence. These are forged. You think these papers can scare me? I've overthrown enough enemies, you can't do anything to me. His voice rang out, no longer filled with the strength of a powerful judge, but with tremors and panic in his eyes. These papers are just a scam. He shouted loudly, trying to push away the discomfort enveloping him. But the more he tried, the more his unease became evident. Karoline Leavitt, undaunted, continuing to open the documents and pointing to the bank statements. Forgery. You can deny whatever you want. But how do you explain these destroying documents from your office? Karoline placed another stack of papers on the table, opened a page, and pointed to a letter from one of Hayes' assistants, which clearly stated, cancel the documents about the Freedom Foundation at the direction of Judge Hayes. Ensure no one knows about these transactions. So, how do you explain this letter? Your Honor. Victor Hayes, his face pale, his hands shaking as he looked at the documents, unable to deny it any longer. What are you doing with these? He stared at the letter. Then turned back to Karoline, his eyes showing clear confusion and fear. He knew there was no way out of these undeniable pieces of evidence. Karoline Leavitt, stepping closer, her voice cold. Unwavering, you can deny everything, but the truth cannot be hidden forever. She smiled faintly, a smile that held no joy but the certainty of one who brings justice. Her words rang out like an unrefutable judgment. You have power, but justice does not. Her words were final and heavy, as if nothing could stop her now. Victor Hayes, trembling. His eyes now devoid of pride, his hands still gripping the gavel, trying to resist but unable. Don't do this. He stood frozen, sweat pouring down, but lacking the strength to fight back. All his justifications were now weak, offering no persuasion. Karoline Leavitt, raising her hand, staring directly at him, her voice as cold as ice, sharp as a blade. You can no longer escape the truth. You have dug your own grave. She didn't just bring legal evidence. She also presented secret video recordings of Victor Hayes meeting with representatives of the Freedom Foundation, where he instructed to destroy evidence beneficial to conservative organizations. Quietly, she raised her phone and pressed play, and the sound of the call immediately rang out. You directed the deletion of all records about this fund. No one can know about these transactions. It must remain secret until the very end. The courtroom now seemed to erupt with truth, as everyone turned to look at Victor Hayes, their eyes filled with outrage and disgust. There was no longer any excuse for him. Victor Hayes, standing still, his face as pale as paper, no longer the arrogant judge, but a criminal facing punishment. Don't do this. I can't. His words were stuttered and unfinished, panic had completely taken over his mind. He looked at Karoline with the eyes of someone who realized he could no longer escape the truth. Just as Victor Hayes was about to turn and run, Karoline stood still, her eyes still locked on him, without a trace of mercy. And at that moment, the courtroom door suddenly burst open. And the FBI team rushed in with force. FBI agent, with a firm voice, giving Hayes no chance to retreat. Judge Hayes, we have a warrant for your arrest for corruption, abuse of power, and evidence destruction. The agent's voice rang out strongly, leaving no room for rebuttal. Victor Hayes was left speechless, his defeat complete. The agents entered and immediately surrounded him. The courtroom erupted into thunderous applause, with emotional cheers. Karoline Leavitt had won. She had not only restored justice for the innocent but also shattered the corrupt system that Victor Hayes had built over the years. She was the only one brave enough to confront and defeat the crime that had long existed within the government. Karoline Leavitt, walking forward, her voice gentle but filled with confidence. This is not my victory. This is the victory of justice. She stood firm, her eyes shining with unwavering belief in what she had done.